All on your own, huh? All those city contracts you were awarded, the unions that never caused trouble, the peace and prosperity that you've enjoyed, all that was earned, but not by you. The Baxter business was built on the Conti name.
That's right. And we shouldn't let something as silly as a politician stand in our way.
What does that mean?
It means if this mayor is a problem, there are ways to get a new one.
We have hunted bigger game than that.
Bourbon Street had always thrived on excess. Its neon-lit strip clubs, back-alley gambling parlors, and late-night rendezvous fueled the city's underbelly. It was the kind of place where the drinks flowed fast, the money moved faster, and the lines between business, crime, and politics blurred into a haze of smoke and bourbon. But in the winter of 1963, the music on Bourbon Street wasn't just drowned out by the honky-tonk rhythm of jazz bands and drunken tourists. It was suffocated by the sound of a war. Jim Garrison, New Orleans' hard-charging district attorney, had made it his personal crusade to clean up the French Quarter. At least that's what he told the newspapers. He wasn't just going after the strippers, the club owners, or the working girls. He was gunning for the men in the shadows, the real bosses behind the scenes. And at the center of it all, lurking just beyond the glow of the stage lights, was a familiar name, Marcello. It was a trial that had the city's underworld watching with bated breath. The Flamingo Club, a well-known joint on Bourbon Street, had found itself at the heart of Garrison's crusade. The district attorney had filed a padlocking suit against the club, accusing it of being a front for prostitution, obscenity, and liquor violations. Garrison was relentless, and if he had his way, Bourbon Street would be stripped of its vice by the time spring rolled around. Inside the courtroom, the star witness was a woman whose name was known in every strip club from Louisiana to Las Vegas, Gloria DeLone, better known by her stage name, Tempest Storm. A bombshell redhead with curves that could hypnotize a crowd, she wasn't just any stripper. She was a headliner, a draw, the kind of woman club owners built entire businesses around. But on the witness stand, she wasn't talking about her act. She was talking about fear. Tempest claimed that one of Garrison's own agents, Warren Moiety, had left her scarred for life during a raid on the club. "I mean, he's a rough man," she said. The courtroom leaned in as she described how Moiety and two other agents had come into the club, pretending to be customers, buying drinks for the dancers. And then things had turned ugly. The prosecution's star witnesses, on the other hand, were congressional agents who had gone undercover in the club, claiming that in November dancers had solicited them for overpriced drinks and later offered to commit prostitution. It was all part of Garrison's case, a carefully built narrative of vice and corruption infecting the heart of the French Quarter. But beneath the surface, there was something even bigger at play. Garrison wasn't just interested in the club's owner, Frank Sinopole. He was looking at the money, where it came from, and more importantly, who was really pulling the strings. That's when the name Marcello surfaced. Sinopole admitted under questioning that he had borrowed money from Peter Marcello, the younger brother of Carlos Marcello, the exiled crime boss of New Orleans. But that was all it was, he insisted. A loan. He swore up and down that the club belonged to him, that Peter Marcello had nothing to do with it. Garrison wasn't buying it. And if he could link the Flamingo Club back to Carlos Marcello's family, it meant he wasn't just shutting down Bourbon Street's vice racket. He was going after the biggest name in organized crime in Louisiana. While the trial against the Flamingo Club continued, Garrison found himself on the other side of the courtroom. He was set to stand trial for defamation, charged with accusing 8 city judges of being under the influence of racketeers. Garrison didn't flinch. "Apologize? I have nothing to apologize for," he said when pressed about his accusations. For months, he had been railing against the judges, claiming they had slashed his funding because he was getting too close to something dangerous. They illegally tied up our purse strings, which forced us to stop our investigation of vice conditions, he told the press. They informed us that we were not supposed to investigate anything, that this was a police function. But he wasn't stopping. His investigators continued hammering Bourbon Street. The Times-Picayune reported that in one weekend alone, Garrison's agents made 39 arrests, raiding club after club, pulling in dancers, bartenders, even the president of the Bourbon Street Association of Nightclubs, Larry LaMarca. The crackdown wasn't just on showgirls and barkers. It was about control. And if Garrison could prove the judges had been compromised by men like Marcello, he wouldn't just win the case. He'd prove the entire system was rotten. While New Orleans was tangled in its own war, up in New York, a different kind of battle was being fought, this one in the halls of Congress. The Senate hearings on organized labor and crime were peeling back the layers of corruption in the Teamsters, the operating engineers, and the coin machine industry. And buried inside the testimony was another familiar name, Carlos Marcello. The hearings exposed how organized crime had infiltrated labor unions, taking control of entire industries, shaking down businesses, and lining the pockets of men like Johnny DioGuardi, Tony Dux Corallo, and James Hoffa. They controlled fake union locals, extorted businesses, rigged elections, and funneled millions into rackets. But the most damning revelation came when the coin-operated jukebox industry was exposed as a national racket controlled by the mob. Witness after witness testified that the underworld had carved up the business across 13 states. And right there, alongside Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and John Vitale, was the name Carlos Marcello. The Senate committee didn't mince words. With notable and few exceptions, the efforts of honest employers, employees, labor officials, and public officers have not contained or restrained the spreading control of these mobsters. Marcello's influence wasn't just in New Orleans, it was everywhere. His hands were in jukeboxes, vending machines, unions, and businesses from Louisiana to Chicago. And back in New Orleans, with Jim Garrison breathing down his brother's neck, the war was only just beginning. Carlos Marcello had spent a lifetime bending the law to his will. But in 1963, the walls were closing in. He wasn't just another racketeer running gambling dens and loan sharking operations. He was the undisputed boss of the New Orleans underworld, the man who held the keys to the city's illicit economy. But now, his empire was under siege from two of the most powerful forces in the country, the Supreme Court and Robert Kennedy. For the past 2 years, the government had been on a relentless crusade to banish him from American soil. The first attempt came in 1961, when immigration agents snatched Marcello from Louisiana and dumped him in Guatemala, a move so brazen and reckless that even seasoned gangsters were stunned. But Marcello was nothing if not resourceful. Within weeks, he smuggled himself back into the United States, slipped through the cracks of law enforcement, and re-emerged in New Orleans as if nothing had ever happened. Now the legal battle had reached the highest court in the land. The morning the ruling came down, Marcello already knew what to expect. The Supreme Court had refused to hear his case, meaning that the lower court's decision stood. His deportation fight was far from over, and his criminal trial for illegal re-entry into the country loomed large. The ruling confirmed what everyone already suspected. Marcello's fate was going to be decided in the same city where he had built his empire, New Orleans. It was here, in the sweltering Louisiana courtrooms, where the Justice Department would try to finish what it started. Inside the halls of power, Robert Kennedy wasn't backing down. The Attorney General had made Marcello a personal target, branding him an undesirable alien who needed to be removed from the country at all costs. It didn't matter that Marcello had lived in the US since childhood. It didn't matter that his criminal enterprises had flourished under the noses of local officials for decades. To Kennedy, Marcello was an example, a warning to every other mobster that the federal government was now in the business of breaking the mafia. The problem was, Marcello wasn't easy to get rid of. Deporting him to Guatemala had been a spectacular failure, so now the government was trying something new. Italy. Marcello had been born in Tunisia, but his parents were Italian, and that was all the US Justice Department needed. They leaned on the Italian embassy, pressuring officials to take Marcello back. The Italians weren't happy about it. He learned his nefarious skills in the United States, they protested. They wanted no part of him. But Kennedy wasn't interested in their complaints. He wanted Marcello gone. Behind the scenes, the Justice Department intensified its efforts. Documents proving Marcello's Italian lineage were being gathered, the groundwork for his deportation being laid. The message was clear. The government wouldn't stop until he was out of the country for good. Yet, for all the legal battles, all the court decisions, all the maneuvers by the Justice Department, Marcello was still in New Orleans. He still had his gambling houses, his influence over the police, his network of corrupt officials. And he still had his allies in the underworld. While Marcello fought for his survival, a new war against the Mafia was unfolding on a national scale. That fall, Newsday published a damning report. The federal government had drawn up a top-secret list of 1,300 names, men who were either members of Cosa Nostra or closely affiliated with the organization. The Justice Department had issued a directive: put as many of these men behind bars as possible within 2 years. The list was staggering. Salvatore Momo Giancana in Chicago, Carlo Gambino in New York, Raymond Patriarca in Providence, Vito Genovese in New Jersey. Every major mob figure in the country was now under federal scrutiny, and among those names, Carlos Marcello. His inclusion wasn't just a legal technicality, it was a statement. The government was treating him as one of the top figures in the Mafia, a man whose power stretched beyond Louisiana into the national syndicate. The strategy was simple: attack from every angle. The FBI, the Bureau of Narcotics, the Bureau of Immigration, the IRS, every federal agency had been ordered to dig into every aspect of Marcello's life. His immigration status, his tax records, his narcotics connections. If he had a weakness, the government was going to find it. The mob bosses knew what was coming. Giancana, Gambino, and the others tightened their operations, doubled their security. They understood that if the government was truly serious about bringing down Cosa Nostra, they would need to survive the biggest crackdown in the history of organized crime. As the federal assault on the Mafia intensified, one name kept surfacing: Meyer Lansky. Unlike Marcello, Lansky had managed to stay in the shadows. He wasn't on trial, he wasn't facing deportation, and he wasn't on the front page of every newspaper in America. But he was still there. In Hollywood, Florida, where mobsters had once ruled, the underworld had changed. The gambling parlors had been shut down, the gangsters either dead or retired. But Lansky remained. He was still living in his quiet house on Hibiscus Drive in Hallandale, still pulling the strings from the sidelines. Joseph Valachi, the first Mafia insider to turn government informant, had testified before Congress that Lansky was still tied to Cosa Nostra, still operating in the shadows. Anywhere that Meyer Lansky is, there's Genovese, Valachi told the Senate committee. The ties between Marcello and Lansky went back decades. They had built empires together, manipulated politicians, controlled entire industries. Now, the Justice Department was tightening the noose on both men. By the end of 1963, the pressure was mounting. The government was coming after Marcello, Lansky, and the entire syndicate with everything it had. The Supreme Court had shut down Marcello's appeal, the Justice Department was still pushing for his deportation, and the federal crackdown on Cosa Nostra was in full swing. But Marcello had survived worse. He knew that power wasn't just about money or muscle. It was about influence, about knowing the right judges, the right cops, the right politicians. If the government wanted a war, he was ready to fight. and the story was far from over. Carlos Marcello had spent most of his life defying the government. No matter how many times they tried to throw him out of the country, no matter how many charges they leveled against him, he always found a way to stay one step ahead. He wasn't just another gangster. He was the gangster of New Orleans, a man whose power stretched far beyond Louisiana, his influence woven into the fabric of American crime. But in 1963, the government was closing in. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had made it clear. Marcello had to go. And yet, despite deportation orders, Supreme Court rulings, and an indictment for illegally re-entering the country, Marcello was still there, still running his empire, still untouchable. While the Senate continued its investigations into organized crime, Joe Valachi was pulling back the curtain on Cosa Nostra in Washington. Americans listened in disbelief as Valachi described an underworld where men like Marcello could rule right under the noses of the FBI and city police. Reporters scrambled to find answers. How had the little man managed to avoid justice for so long? It wasn't just luck. It was strategy. Marcello had been fighting the government since the 1950s. 13 years earlier, he had been named as the boss of Louisiana's Mafia, handpicked by Frank Costello in a meeting at the New Orleans Black Diamond Club. He had a rap sheet going back to 1929, when he served time for a drug offense. By 1947, he had a stranglehold on organized crime in Louisiana. Gambling, extortion, rackets, all running through his hands. His partnerships stretched far beyond the bayous. Dandy Phil Castile, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky. These were the men who had turned the Beverly Club into a multi-million-dollar gambling empire. By the early 1950s, the government finally took notice. The K-Forver Committee put Marcello in the national spotlight. The Justice Department moved in, and in 1953, his deportation process began. It took 2 years of appeals, but by 1955, the Supreme Court finally ruled that Marcello was deportable. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Enter Jack Wasserman. Wasserman wasn't a gangster. He wasn't a fixer. He was an immigration lawyer, and one of the smartest in the business. A Harvard graduate with a reputation for saving men the government wanted gone, Wasserman had built a career protecting the underworld's biggest names. His client list read like a mafia roll call: Frank Costello, the retired Prime Minister of the underworld; Russell Bufalino, the Pennsylvania crime boss suspected of arranging the Appalachian Conference; Big Bill Leas, the gambling king of Wheeling, West Virginia; Mike Spinella, a mobster deported to Italy, only to sneak back into the US before being caught again; and, of course, Carlos Marcello. Wasserman was the best at what he did, using legal loopholes, procedural delays, and constitutional protections to keep his clients in the country. After the Supreme Court ruled Marcello deportable in 1955, Wasserman convinced an Italian court to block his return to Italy. Then, in 1961, when the Immigration Service tried to dump Marcello in Guatemala, Wasserman argued that the birth records were forged. The whole case fell apart. Marcello was back, and he wasn't going anywhere. Despite Wasserman's brilliance, the government wasn't giving up. Marcello was still under federal indictment for illegal re-entry into the United States. His legal team had been fighting tooth and nail to get the charges dropped. But on October 10th, Judge Herbert Christenbury refused to dismiss the case. This was Marcello's 4th Supreme Court battle, and his 4th loss. The Justice Department wasn't stopping at the illegal re-entry case. On October 28th, Marcello and his brother Joseph were set to stand trial for conspiracy. The charge? Fraudulently obtaining a Guatemalan birth certificate. The government's strategy was clear. If they couldn't deport Marcello, they'd convict him. While Marcello prepared for trial, the spotlight turned to Jack Wasserman. Who was this quiet, soft-spoken lawyer who had kept some of America's most notorious criminals from being thrown out of the country? Reporters described him as mild-mannered, almost angelic, a devoted family man, a Jewish philanthropist, a churchgoer. And yet, his closest associates were men who controlled entire cities. Marcello, Bufalino, Costello, Spinella, these weren't just clients, they were friends. His 17-year-old son, Michael, had gone hunting at Marcello's private lodge in the Louisiana bayous. His wife had scolded a reporter for calling Marcello a racketeer. His daughter Lorraine defended her father's clients to her classmates at the University of Maryland. Wasserman was more than a lawyer. He was the last line of defense for men like Marcello. And if the government wanted to bring Marcello down, they had to go through him first. The FBI, the Justice Department, the Supreme Court, all had tried to remove Marcello. All had failed. Now, it was the court's turn. Marcello was heading to trial. His empire was under attack. And Wasserman was preparing for one of the biggest fights of his career. But Marcello had been here before. He had outlasted them all. And he wasn't about to start losing now. The trial of Carlos Marcello was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a battle for survival. The Justice Department had spent years trying to drive him out of the country, and now, with Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime in full swing, Marcello was in the crosshairs. His fortress of influence in Louisiana had shielded him from prosecution for decades. He had outmaneuvered the FBI, the Immigration Service, and the Supreme Court. But this time, the government was determined to make an example of him. The charge? Conspiracy to defraud the United States. At the heart of the case was the fraudulent Guatemalan birth certificate that had played a key role in Marcello's 1961 deportation debacle. If the government could prove that Marcello and his brother, Joseph, had conspired to obtain false documents to block his deportation, they could finally do what years of court battles had failed to accomplish: put the little man behind bars. But Marcello was not going down without a fight. The courtroom in New Orleans was packed. This wasn't just another racketeering case. This was Carlos Marcello on trial. His attorneys, led by Jack Wasserman, knew exactly what they were up against. The press had followed every twist and turn of Marcello's deportation saga for years. There wasn't a man, woman, or bartender in Louisiana who didn't have an opinion about the boss of the bayou. A fair trial in New Orleans? Impossible, they argued. In front of U.S. District Judge Herbert Christenberry, Wasserman made his move, a request for a change of venue. He painted a picture of a city where the headlines had already convicted Marcello, where jurors were stepping into the courtroom knowing more about the case than the lawyers themselves. But Christenberry wasn't buying it. The trial would stay in New Orleans, and it would start in 6 days. Marcello's team threw everything they had at the judge. Motion to dismiss the charges? Denied. Motion to delay the trial? Denied. Motion to move the trial out of Louisiana? Denied. The courtroom was set. The government wasn't budging. On October 28th, the trial began. The jury had been seated. The government was ready to go. But Marcello's defense had one last move up their sleeve. The prosecution's star witness was a man named Carl Irving Knoll, an ex-con, a drifter, and a man with a very questionable past. Marcello's attorneys weren't just going to challenge his credibility, they were going to destroy it. Their angle? Knoll was insane. Wasserman requested a mental examination, calling Knoll a psychopathic liar who was spinning a tale just to keep himself out of prison. And the judge? He granted the request. The trial was delayed. The defense had landed its first punch. When the trial resumed, Knoll took the stand. In front of a silent courtroom, he laid it all out. He described how he bribed Guatemalan officials to forge a birth certificate for Marcello. He named names. He revealed the layers of corruption and deception that had kept Marcello in the country. This wasn't just a slip-up or a misunderstanding. This was a full-scale operation, and it wasn't cheap. Noel's testimony reached a new level of detail. He described how the Marcellos discussed bribes ranging from $15,000 to $100,000 to secure the false documents. He identified the key figures in Guatemala who helped manipulate the system. The names Eduardo Rodriguez Geniz, the Prime Minister of Guatemala, and Antonio Valladares, a powerful law partner, were spoken aloud in the courtroom. The government was painting a picture of a criminal empire operating at the highest levels, and Marcello was at the center of it. The courtroom drama took an unexpected turn when Carl Noel's wife took the stand. She told the jury about a $100 dress, a gift she had purchased in New Orleans for the wife of the Guatemalan Prime Minister. It was a small detail, but it carried weight. It was proof that bribes had been made, that connections had been established, and that Marcello had gone to extreme lengths to keep himself from being thrown out of the country. But the defense wasn't backing down. They moved for a mistrial. Their argument: they had been blocked from introducing evidence about Noel's mental health history. Judge Christenberry denied the motion. The trial would continue. As the government wrapped up its case, they brought in an expert, a handwriting analyst from the FBI. He had compared the handwriting on Marcello's fraudulent birth certificate with other records from San Jose Pinula, Guatemala. His conclusion? The document was fake. It was one thing for Noel to say it. It was another for a federal expert to confirm it. The case against Marcello was tightening. But the little man had one last card to play. Carlos Marcello had survived deportation, indictments, Supreme Court rulings, and FBI investigations. Now, for the first time, he was facing the real possibility of a prison sentence. The prosecution had laid out its case. The evidence was damning. The question was, would it be enough? Marcello had spent a lifetime outsmarting the government. Would 1963 be the year they finally put him away? The trial wasn't over yet, and Carlos Marcello wasn't done fighting. Carlos Marcello had walked into the courtroom in October 1963 as a man on the verge of losing everything. The Justice Department had spent years trying to exile him, bury him in legal battles, and finally put him behind bars. And yet, on November 22nd, 1963, as John Kennedy lay dying in Dallas, Marcello was walking free. After 2 weeks of testimony, the case against Carlos and Joseph Marcello was winding down. The government had thrown everything they had at him. Witnesses who swore that Marcello had bribed Guatemalan officials to get a fake birth certificate. Handwriting experts who confirmed that the documents were fraudulent. Ex-convict Carl Irving Noel, who detailed the payments, the forgeries, and the entire scheme to keep Marcello in America. But Marcello's defense team, led by Jack Wasserman, had dismantled the case piece by piece. Noel was a con man, a swindler, and a liar. The bribes could not be definitively linked to Marcello himself. And most importantly, the government had no smoking gun, just the testimony of a questionable witness. On November 21st, 1963, after the final arguments, the jury deliberated. And then the world changed. As the sun rose over New Orleans on November 22nd, Carlos Marcello was a free man. The jury had acquitted him and his brother Joseph, rejecting the government's case. The prosecution's key witness had been too unreliable, the evidence too thin. The little man had won again, but his greatest enemy had lost. That same afternoon, John F. Kennedy was shot dead in Dallas. The assassination sent shockwaves through the country, but for Marcello, it was something else entirely. Relief. For years, Kennedy had been his nightmare. The deportation to Guatemala had nearly killed him, and Robert Kennedy's relentless war on organized crime had made his life hell. But now, with JFK gone, the war was about to change. The whispers started almost immediately. Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who gunned down Lee Harvey Oswald, had deep ties to organized crime. David Ferry, Marcello's personal pilot, had been seen with Oswald. Guy Bannister, the ex-FBI agent turned private investigator, had been running anti-Castro operations out of New Orleans, operations linked to Oswald. And then there was Marcello himself. For years he had told associates that getting rid of a dog's head would end its bite. The dog's head was JFK. The bite was Robert Kennedy. And now, one was dead. For the next 12 years, Marcello lived under the shadow of November 22nd, 1963. Jim Garrison's investigation into the Kennedy assassination led back to New Orleans. Witnesses who could link Marcello to the crime started dying, one by one. David Ferry was found dead in 1967, supposedly of natural causes. Sam Giancana was shot in his basement in 1975, just before testifying to the Senate. Johnny Roselli disappeared, only for his mutilated body to be found in an oil drum in 1976. And yet, Marcello remained untouchable, until the government finally got him. By 1975, the entire underworld was under siege. The Senate Intelligence Committee, led by Frank Church, was investigating the CIA's role in political assassinations. The names of Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Russell Bufalino kept coming up. Had the Mafia worked with the CIA to kill Fidel Castro? Had they instead turned those assassination skills against Kennedy himself? Was the mob at the center of the greatest cover-up in American history? Even as the Senate closed in on the Kennedy conspiracy, the Justice Department went after Marcello the old-fashioned way. A racketeering case. On January 7, 1975, Marcello was indicted under the RICO Act, accused of strong-arming his way into a nightclub called the Crash Landing. For the first time, it looked like the little man was out of moves. But then, the most surreal moment of his career happened. While Marcello fought federal charges, the U.S. Defense Department unknowingly exposed itself as one of his best customers. Marcello's Pelican Tomato Company had won a $1.1 million contract to supply tomatoes, strawberries, and cantaloupes to Army, Navy, and Air Force bases. The U.S. government had spent over $1 million buying produce from a man they had spent decades trying to deport. It was a perfectly legal contract, because under federal law, the lowest bidder wins. The government had played right into Marcello's hands, and even as the feds tried to put him away, his tomatoes were feeding the troops. Carlos Marcello had survived deportation, indictments, Senate hearings, and assassination rumors. For decades, he had been at the center of America's biggest crime stories, from mafia control of Louisiana to the assassination of John Kennedy. But he wasn't finished yet. The final battle of his life was still to come. And this time, the government wasn't leaving anything to chance. By 1975, Carlos Marcello had weathered more storms than most men could imagine. He had beaten deportation, conspiracy charges, and Robert Kennedy's relentless crusade against the Mafia. He had seen presidents rise and fall, friends assassinated, and enemies buried in swamps. But the Senate hearings, the renewed JFK investigation, and the collapse of Watergate had opened a new battlefield, one Marcello couldn't control as easily as he did New Orleans. The secrets buried for over a decade were starting to surface, and this time, the game had changed. Carlos Marcello had spent decades building an empire, but his name alone was enough to destroy even the most legitimate of ventures. His brother, Joseph Marcello Jr., was learning that the hard way. Joseph had applied for a liquor license for Broussard's restaurant in New Orleans' French Quarter. On paper, it should have been routine. He had no criminal record. He claimed to have served as an official host for U.S. State Department events. He was just another businessman. But his last name was Marcello, and that was enough. The application was denied. His character and reputation were in question. Joseph swore under oath that he had hosted international dignitaries at State Department luncheons and dinners. But when reporters checked, the State Department had no record of such events. Instead, the reality was more humiliating. Yes, international figures had dined at one of Joseph's restaurants, but they hadn't been hosted by the government. They had been brought in by volunteer organizers. It was another lesson in power. The Marcello name still carried weight, but it was now a weight that crushed more than it lifted. Fidel Castro had survived more assassination attempts than any man in modern history. And now, in an interview with Jamaican Prime Minister Michael Manley, he openly discussed the CIA's relentless pursuit of his life. The stories were as chilling as they were absurd. 1961. A poisoned chocolate milkshake designed to kill him in 3 days without a trace. The plan failed when the poison vial shattered in the refrigerator. 1971. A team of Venezuelan journalists with hidden weapons inside TV cameras waiting to ambush him during a foreign visit. Countless others. Snipers, explosives, poisoned cigars. Castro admitted he had no direct proof that John or Robert Kennedy had ordered the plots. But he knew one thing for certain. The CIA had been behind them. And he knew another thing. If the US government wanted to kill him that badly, what was stopping them from turning those same tactics on their own president? Joseph Marcello wasn't done fighting. After having his liquor license rejected, he took the city of New Orleans to court. And, in a stunning reversal, Civil District Judge Melvin Duran ruled in his favor. The city was ordered to grant him the license. The judge didn't buy the vice squad's claim that Joseph was a ranking member of the Louisiana Mafia. He dismissed the city council's arguments as nothing more than a rehash of the same old allegations. And in his final ruling, he noted something remarkable. In the French Quarter, Joseph Marcello had a good reputation. It was a rare moment where the Marcello family won in court. But it didn't erase the fact that the walls were still closing in. In Defuniak Springs, Florida, a seemingly small environmental dispute was escalating into something far more sinister. The Oyster Lake Association had filed a lawsuit against local officials to stop road repairs near State Road 30A, citing serious drainage issues and pollution. But buried within the case was a name that set off alarms: Senna, a New Orleans businessman with known ties to Carlos Marcello. Senna had already been arrested for land violations, accused of illegally bulldozing dunes and rerouting natural water flows. Local residents saw their homes flooded, their property values collapse, and their environment destroyed. And behind it all, Marcello's influence lurked in the background. The corruption extended from Louisiana to Florida, from real estate to politics. And once again, federal investigators were taking notice. By 1976, the connection between the Mafia and the CIA was no longer just a whisper in the shadows. It was headline news. Rolling Stone magazine published a bombshell article linking Meyer Lansky, Carlos Marcello, and the Kennedy assassination to a decades-old pact between organized crime and the U.S. intelligence community. The piece laid out a chilling timeline: World War II. The U.S. Navy made a deal with Lucky Luciano to control the docks and prevent Nazi sabotage. Post-war, the Mafia helped the CIA crush communist strikes in Europe. The 1950s, the Mafia, the CIA, and corrupt politicians like Richard Nixon operated in the shadows, shaping world events. The 1960s, the syndicate helped plan the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. When JFK pulled back, they turned on him. The article wasn't just a history lesson, it was a warning. It showed how criminals, spies, and politicians had worked together for decades, and how those relationships still shaped the world in 1976. Watergate, the CIA assassinations, the Senate investigations. It all tied back to that unholy alliance. And at the center of it all, in the shadows, were men like Carlos Marcello. Men who had survived everything. But for how much longer? By 1976, Carlos Marcello was no longer just a gangster. He was a walking time bomb. The Senate investigations were closing in. The press was openly exposing his name in connections to JFK, Watergate, and the CIA. The government had already failed to deport him. They had failed to convict him in 1963. But now they were ready to bring him down for good. Because this time, they weren't just fighting the mafia. They were fighting the ghosts of the past. And Carlos Marcello was the last man standing. The storm was coming. And there was nowhere left to hide. By 1976, the American mafia was no longer just a collection of gangsters running street rackets. It was a shadow empire, stretching from the neon-lit casinos of Las Vegas to the quiet, sun-drenched banks of the lower Rio Grande Valley. It was in politics, real estate, narcotics, international money laundering, and even pornography. The names were familiar: Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, Meyer Lansky. But their reach had grown deeper, more insidious. And as government reports, assassinations, and investigative journalism peeled back the layers, the full extent of their power was finally being exposed. The Texas Organized Crime Prevention Council had seen enough. Their annual report painted a grim picture. At least 5 mafia families were attempting to carve up Dallas, a city that law enforcement now considered up for grabs. The lower Rio Grande Valley was being used as a laundromat for dirty money, with mafia-backed businesses filtering millions of dollars into the legitimate economy. A Houston physician was marked for execution because of his knowledge of organized crime figures who had drained a supper club of its profits. Real estate, apartment complexes, restaurants, vending companies, all were now under quiet mafia control. Even in Texas, where organized crime had always been seen as a secondary concern compared to Chicago or New York, the mafia was now embedded into the fabric of the economy. And the Marcello name surfaced yet again. The report revealed that Joseph Marcello, Carlos Marcello's right-hand man and brother, had ownership in the Pelican Tomato Company, a Louisiana-based operation that had already drawn government scrutiny. Carlos Marcello had once told Congress that the Pelican Tomato Company netted him $20,000 per year. Now, it was at the center of a statewide investigation into mafia money laundering. No matter where law enforcement looked, the Marcello empire left fingerprints on the underworld's most lucrative enterprises. Tampa, Florida, had long been a mafia stronghold, but it took the murder of an ex-cop to bring national attention to just how deep the underworld had its claws in the city. Richard Cloud was no ordinary policeman. After being forced out of the Tampa Police Department, he had declared a one-man war against the mafia, digging into its criminal networks, its political ties, and its gambling enterprises. It was a war that ended with 4 bullets from a hired assassin. Cloud's death forced a reckoning. Tampa Police Chief Charles Otero had downplayed the mafia's presence for years, insisting it was a minor issue. Sheriff Malcolm Beard had echoed the same sentiment. Most of the organized crime that Tampa was once famous for is gone. But a 2-month investigation by the Tampa Times shattered those illusions. The evidence showed that Tampa's underworld was thriving. 150 individuals linked to the mafia, spanning 100 businesses in Tampa alone. Connections to the New Orleans, New York, Detroit, and Miami crime families. The Trafficante empire was still firmly in control. Gambling, narcotics, prostitution, and even government contracts. More disturbingly, Cloud's assassination was tied to a much larger conspiracy. A federal indictment 3 weeks prior named Frank Diesidu, a Trafficante lieutenant, and Victor Manuel Acosta, a powerful cocaine trafficker, as the architects of a murder-for-hire ring targeting multiple men. Cloud was just one of several targets. His death was not just a killing, it was a message. A warning that the Tampa Mafia wasn't going anywhere. For decades, the Mafia had made its money from illegal gambling, bolita, sports betting, and high-stakes card rooms. But in 1976, the game had changed. Gambling, once the cornerstone of the Tampa syndicate, had now taken a back seat to narcotics. And nobody was more deeply entrenched in that trade than Santo Trafficante Jr. The Times investigation revealed the Tampa Mafia controlled bookmaking. Sports betting had replaced Bolita as the biggest moneymaker. But more money than ever was being funneled into narcotics. Cocaine, heroin, and marijuana shipments were being smuggled in from Asia, South America, and the Caribbean. One federal grand jury had estimated that $1.5 billion was being generated annually from bookmaking in just one Florida county. But cocaine profits dwarfed that number. Victor Manuel Acosta, Trafficante's cocaine lieutenant, had built a pipeline from South America straight to Florida. And in 1976, he was a fugitive, wanted for murder. Acosta's Tampa drug ring was connected to Miami's infamous Ricky Cravero gang, which had flooded Florida with thousands of pounds of cocaine and marijuana. By the time federal agents started closing in, 40 murders had already been attributed to the drug war. Tampa, once known as a gambling capital, was now a nerve center for the U.S. cocaine trade. And Trafficante was still the man pulling the strings. The mafia's influence wasn't just in drugs and gambling. In Tampa, Miami, and Atlanta, the underworld had seized control of the multi-million-dollar pornography business. At the center of the operation was Michael George Thievis, a man who had turned an Atlanta-based greeting card company into a $100 million empire of smut. But the real owners of the pornography business weren't men like Thievis. They were the mafia families of New York and New Jersey. The Gambino and De Cavalcante families controlled adult bookstores and peep show operations. The Trafficante family distributed smut films through Florida-based companies. Thievis himself was merely a front for the real power, the mafia. In one chilling moment, at a Las Vegas convention for porn distributors, a mafia figure made it clear to Thievis who was really in charge. Thievis had boasted, "I own 90% of the sex film vending machines in the country." A New Jersey mobster responded coldly, "Don't forget, Mike. You manage those machines. The family is in charge." Even in Tampa, law enforcement knew the mafia had its hands deep in the industry. But when Florida investigators wanted to raid a major porn distribution warehouse in Tampa, they were blocked by the state attorney's office. The message was clear. Even the law wasn't safe from mafia influence. By mid-1976, the mafia was still thriving, but the tide was beginning to turn. Everywhere, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, federal agencies were piecing together the full picture of organized crime. Carlos Marcello, the undisputed kingpin of the South, was once again under the microscope. Santo Trafficante, America's last true mafia boss of Havana, had built a narco empire stretching from Asia to Florida. But the investigations, the indictments, and the headlines were drawing blood. For the first time in decades, the mafia was on the defensive, and the storm was far from over.